everybody. Thank you for staying for the talk back. Before we begin, I'd love to just introduce our lovely moderators. We have two members of the Speakers and Screeners team, Jack Stein and Caroline Knight. Jack is a junior studying MCM, and Caroline is a freshman studying MCM and Lit Arts. So without further ado, Jack and Caroline.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning into our discussion. My name is Caroline Knight. I'm a first year at Brown and one of the co-moderators with Jack.
Yeah, I'm Jack. I'm a third year at Brown.
All right. So Ellie Foumbi is an actor, writer, and director from Cameroon whose work has been screened at Venice, Holly Shorts, and Santa Barbara International Film Festival. She holds an MFA from Columbia University's School of the Arts in Directing, in addition to participating in the Berlinale Talent and New York Film Festival's Artist Academy. Her projects have been supported by the Venice Biennale College Cinema, SF Film and the Kenneth Renan Foundation, the Gotham Snowboarders Project Forum, the Film Independent Screenwriting Lab, and the Tribeca Film Institute. Ellie made her TV directorial debut on BET's hip-hop anthology Tales. Her short film Home was commissioned by Netflix in association with Film Independent and premiered on their Netflix Film Club's YouTube channel, where it got over 18,000 views. Her first feature film, Our Father the Devil, premiered at the Venice International Film Festival, and she's a member of the Screen Actors Guild and the Directors Guild of America. Now let us introduce Ellie Foumbi.
It's great to have you at Ivy Film Festival.
Thank you. Thanks. I'm glad to be here.
So if we could just jump into questions about the film, I'd say maybe just to kick things off, my first question, I was really curious over the course of the film about kind of the depictions of violence that were featured throughout, and more specifically, the selectivity that went into when to show certain acts of violence and when to cut away and show different things and kind of leave it to the audience's imagination. And I was kind of curious about your motivation for what to show and when to pull back, kind of with those
Such a good question.
sequences.
I felt like from the beginning, I knew that I didn't want to show a lot of the physical violence on screen, because I felt like a lot of it is so psychological. It's in her body, and I also didn't want to re-traumatize audiences. I also chose not to show any flashbacks of the past for that reason, and so in kind of staying with my decisions not to show that, I wanted to find a more creative way to engage the audience. And for me, sometimes, like, as a lover of horror movies, it's more about like what you don't see, and like you can use sound in creative ways and make the audience feel uncomfortable and give them a sense of what's happening without them actually having to see it.
Yeah, I definitely got that through the film. It was really masterfully done.
Thank you.
And another thing that really interested me is I'm also a lover of horror movies. I love horror, I love mystery, and I was sort of wondering if you would consider this film as horror, as a lot of horror films don't incorporate a lot of realistic imagery. I was wondering if maybe you would identify it with another genre or associate it differently?
This film?
Yes.
I mean, I don't know, like it's so many films in one for me. It at the core, I think it's a thriller, you know, because you are really in that tension of like what's going to happen and, you know, where's this going to lead. But I also think it's the psychological elements of it, you know, it's also a psychological drama. It's also, I definitely don't think of it as a horror movie, but I think the camera language that I used, and just this idea of like not showing and withholding information from the audience, and kind of using sound in a specific way, like those are some of the horror tricks, I guess, that I used, because it's the genre that I love so much, and I think it's just like seeped into my style.
Yeah, I think I could really tell. I feel like the way that those influences and just kind of using that language is really powerful, even if it's not in the same way we're super used to, but being able to evoke the feelings that we feel while experiencing horror films really came into play a lot, especially with those kind of scenes without violence.
Thank you.
Yeah, leaning on the dialogue and the incredible performances from the actors.
Yeah, I mean, I was really lucky with the cast, and I feel like when you have those kinds of actors, like some of the long takes, which was something, again, we decided early on that we wanted to let the scenes play out, and for me, I feel like it's a lot easier to build tension when you're not cutting away and you're kind of forcing the audience to sit in the discomfort of like those moments, like that kitchen scene when he comes in, and like even when we were shooting it, we were very unsettled. Even though I knew what was going to happen, I also didn't, because of the way they were performing it. So definitely the performances, I think, soar through that kind of use of long takes.
Yeah, the film really, it feels like it leans on these tensions with inside of these characters, where they have these pasts that are slowly unveiled to the audience, and they're both trying in their own way to forge a new life for themselves and move on from those pasts. And one thing I was wondering about was how you decided when to really start revealing that to the audience. It was kind of unfolding throughout the course of the film, and those moments, like the moment where it was revealed that he was who she thought he was, and right when we thought maybe she was wrong, and even she thought she was wrong. We were on the same page, and suddenly it all comes crashing down in that moment. Or the moment toward the end where it's revealed that she also had committed atrocities as well, in addition to what he'd done, and kind of showing a new side to both of those characters. And I'm curious about how you decided when to tell and when to hide that information.
I feel like a lot of that came in the writing process. Very late, I discovered that I think it was like one of either my last draft or my second to last draft. I discovered that part of the reason she couldn't forgive him is because she couldn't forgive herself. And there was this deep shame that I think became so clear to me in that pass. And for me, it was like a very impactful way to end the film and to reveal that she was also a perpetrator of violence and that she had also committed atrocities. And once I kind of discovered that, I worked my way backwards. And I'm someone who, I kind of made the film for myself, in the sense that I'm someone who's always ahead of films, and I always know what's going to happen, and I can kind of see it even in little clues. I'm like, oh, I know, I can usually guess who the killer is. And so I was like, how do I trick somebody like myself? How do I destabilize the audience? How do I make them engaged with the film in a way that they are not going to get what they expect? And so I was trying to walk a line between, figuring out how much information do I give you for you to be able to maintain, to not be lost in the story, and for you to be engaged in Marie's character and all the other characters, but without giving away too much. So it was a lot of it was trial and error at the script stage, and getting feedback from friends, and sort of knowing at what point I was tipping my hand too early. But I always knew that I wanted to deliver information bit by bit, which for me is also part of a good thriller.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I definitely think you succeeded. Jack and I were talking before this about how towards the beginning of the movie, we truly were thinking that Marie had gotten the wrong guy, and that definitely wasn't Sogo, just based on his mannerisms, his personality. And we were discussing, I guess, the prevalence of religion in the film, and in day-to-day life, there are a lot of people who associate with the Catholic faith and look up to a priest as a symbol of religious pride and purity, and clearly as Sogo's, or as a new pastor, Patrick, associates himself with the Catholic faith, we truly see that he has changed himself and he chooses to rid himself from his immoral past. And I was sort of wondering, through this film, were you trying to demonstrate how maybe Christianity or just religion in general can have, I guess, transformational effects on the individual, whether this relates to them trying to dissociate themselves from their past or certain immoral doings that they had in a previous life, and you see religion as a type of rebirth or repentance?
I think it's both. I think there's two, unfortunately, we've seen religion used in very bad ways. I mean, when I was doing a lot of research on child soldiers and on warlords and how the children are recruited in Africa, in a lot of cases, unfortunately, religion was used to indoctrinate them. And I feel like, we see the bad side of religion, but religion also has this other beautiful side where you can, reinvent yourself, you can start over, you can do better, you can atone for your sins. And so for me, it felt so right that he should be a priest. And that we should, because I was asking these questions, like, is he actually atoning? Is he actually, has he actually changed? Like, these are questions that I was trying to figure out as I was writing the script. And I mean, everyone's gonna take away different things. Some people don't think he has, some people think he has. Like, whatever you see is valid, but I like the idea that religion allowed me to open up that dialogue and to keep an interesting conversation about that open.
Yeah, maybe taking it a little bit more in the direction of talking about the process behind the film. I think as a young filmmaker, and I'm sure many other students feel this way, it can be a little bit daunting looking at the landscape right now with the types of films that are getting made, the pathways people take to getting work. It seems, harder and harder to be someone with a vision and bring it to life in a feature like this. And I'd love to hear a little bit about kind of the process of how this film came to be, for you.
Yeah, it is indeed a very daunting landscape, especially with the pandemic. But I think, so I made this film through the Venice Biennale College, which is an incredible program that funds micro-budget features under 200,000 euros. And I think it's a wonderful opportunity for young filmmakers, or even for a first film. It's free money that you don't have to pay back, so it's not easy to make a film on that budget. It's very complicated, especially nowadays, particularly with the pandemic and all the additional fees and stuff that you have to be responsible for. But I do think that if you have the right story that can be made in this context, I think it's an incredible opportunity. And for me, this was kind of the way that I decided to make my first film. The other thing that was wonderful about it was having a network of support. There were mentors that we were assigned within the program, and I felt like they were kind of holding my hand through the process of making my first film, and I was able to ask them questions and talk to other filmmakers who had been in the program and just kind of get an idea of what to expect with, going through the process of making a film and then festivals. And I mean, it doesn't ever really prepare you for being out there, but I think you're a little more prepared than you would have been if you were just doing it on your own. So it's a good program to look at.
Definitely. And tying back to the process, I was also wondering, did you have any other titles that you were thinking about for the film? Did the title come before the production, or did you have the production prior to naming the film? Were there any other ideas that you potentially had in play?
There was another title because I had made a short that was kind of loosely based on this idea, and the title was very different. I mean, it changed. I think the main character in the short was actually a man. And he was not a priest, but it was sort of his character. And then once I changed it and I set it in France and I centered the film around her, that title just wasn't appropriate anymore. And Our Father the Devil, for some reason, just came to me. I don't know how. It just felt right. There was something about like the Father and the devil together, because I was thinking of, for me, it was more of a symbol of her crisis of faith, and not so much like my dad thought it was about him at some point. He was really mad at me. He was like, "What did I do to you? I've always been a good dad." And I'm like, "It's not about you." So yeah, I just the two things came together pretty early on in the writing of the new draft.
I think you definitely tied it together well, because the entire film, it just seems as if it's purely from the perspective of Mary. And you can, even with the title as well, you can sort of see how we as an audience are also moving through her trauma with her. As we're acknowledging her past, we're acknowledging what's happening in the present, and I guess all the emotions that she's trying to deal with all at once as Sogo came back into her life. So I can definitely tell how the title, even the scenes, the interactions she has with other characters as well, it's very interesting to watch all of it unfold.
And we talked briefly backstage about the cabin in the film, and I would just love to talk a little bit more about that. I think that, it's really fascinating, the use of space and the way that really came to life. And if you want to talk just a little bit about the story behind that, and kind of how the cabin came to be, and where you kind of place that in the story thematically as well.
Yeah, I mean, that cabin, from the beginning, we knew it was going to be hard to find because it needed to be isolated. I wanted it to be up in the mountains, so it was like finding the cabin that felt isolated but that wasn't too hard to get to. And so we looked at a lot of cabins, and it wasn't until, like, I would say maybe 3 weeks before the shoot that we found this one. It was about a 40-minute drive up the mountain, though, and there was a big debate as to whether it was worth it, and there was a safety concern and all of these things. And finally, that view, there was just this feeling. We went and visited other cabins, and then we just knew, no, we have to go back to that one. There was something special about that view and the location. And then our production designer felt really confident that he could turn it into something special. The cabin, when we went in there, had nothing in it. It was just plain, no sinks, no furniture, like nothing on the walls. It was just like the kind of cabin for hikers who are passing through to be able to have shelter in case they're like caught in the rain or something. So we put most of our resources into making it what you saw it, and it was a lot of, to the point where halfway through construction, we were like, because we blew out the back of the cabin to be able to put the camera back there and create more space. So if you were to walk in there, it would feel so much smaller than it does on screen because we had that extra space behind. But I think halfway through putting it all together, I was like, did we make the right decision? It was such an emotional, like such a physical heavy lift. But we also knew like half the film is in this cabin. And the world of Marie and Father Patrick is really centered in this location. So we just pushed through and felt like, okay, this is where the bulk of our resources are going, and we just have to accept that, and we did. And I feel like it paid off.
There are also a lot of scenes where Marie is, I guess, by herself or in isolated places. Like the entire movie, like the cabin takes place in the countryside. And I was wondering, you kind of sort of answered it, but was this intentional to ensure that Marie was sort of in isolated spaces? Was this based on her, in the context of the movie, based upon her decision to be in more isolated spaces so she could, I guess, have more time with herself?
Yeah. Also, I mean, this was a cabin. This was given to her by her mentor, Jeanne. And the other, I think, to answer your question about like just thematically, for me, the fact that it was in nature and that there was a kind of a connection or a recall to her childhood, to them being in the jungle. So it felt like kind of a good way to tie in their background. And also just, practically speaking, the isolation was important for her to be able to torture him and not have anybody hear him scream. So it sort of served both purposes.
Yeah, definitely in those scenes where Sogo would just be in the cabin and Marie would come back, it was sort of just making me think about how silence is so loud.
Yeah.
And how essentially just once you're encapsulated by it for such a long period of time, it starts to take over your entire life and your entire brain capacity at that same time. So she definitely, she managed to torture him in a way that was very effective, I would say.
Yeah, and then for me, it was, that space felt so different from all the other spaces. The fact that it was in nature and that it was in the mountains and everything else was kind of in the city, it helped to start to build this demarcation between the two sides. Like, she is now leading a double life, and her ability to compartmentalize and be able to go to work and do what she was doing, and then go back to the cabin and torture this guy, was part of the trauma, part of that was the way to show how messed up she was and how she was able to do that. And I think for me it became a great way to build the thriller elements in the film, because at some point someone's gonna go looking for him, and so it was also fun. We had a lot of fun torturing Father Patrick. He does not like this. He was very mad at us, but we did. And I think that one of the things I love, especially in Babetita Sajo's performance, is that it's kind of tragic, but you see her reconnecting with herself and opening up emotionally, even to the love interest in the bartender. As she's starting, the more she tortures him, the more she's sort of reconnecting with herself. And I think that's something I wrote in the script that, I didn't quite know how it would come together in the performance, and the way that Babetita sort of incarnated that was really special. It's not something you can ever plan for. It was just like magic in a bottle.
I would love to ask about that unforgettable final shot in the film. And because it goes back to what you were saying about trying to create a film that you wouldn't be able to predict. And there were, even coming out of the end of the film, it still felt like there were a lot of different ways that it could have ended. And that was and I thought that was a great way, but I'm curious if there were other ideas in contention, how long it took for you to really settle on that ending, or if it was something that always felt like the best way to go.
No, the ending was really tricky. I felt like I'd painted myself into a corner, and I didn't quite know how to get them out of it. There was a very, very early version of I think it was the first version, where she and Nadia killed him together. And I was like, no, this does not feel right. But I didn't know how to get her out of the cabin, and then Nadia became the key. And that I think came a bit later, once the actors, I sort of knew I was writing it for Suleiman, because I'd worked with him before. And also Babetita, I had her in mind. I had those two actors in mind for those roles. But it wasn't until I found Nadia, Jennifer who plays Nadia, and that the three of us were able to have conversations, that it became clear that she was the key to getting Marie out of the cabin, because Marie needs to feel that unconditional love. She needs to feel that someone is still going to accept her and care for her despite her past, despite the stuff that she's done. And it was very in line with some of the research I'd done. There's a very, very high suicide rate amongst child soldiers, particularly because of this heavy burden and this shame that they feel, and this feeling that they have a very hard time reintegrating into society. because they feel that their sins are not forgivable and that they're no longer lovable. And so I sort of carried that thread into building Marie's character. And so it became so powerful at the end when Nadia says, I'm never gonna leave you. Like, you know, I'm here, I'm gonna help you. Like, for me, that was sort of the key to unlocking her, whatever state that she's in, to sort of letting her know that it was okay to forgive herself, basically, and then by virtue of that, forgiving him.
Right. And something that's really interesting as well is the friendship that Nadia and Marie have over time, and that grows over time. Originally, with the love interest Arnaud, I was sort of thinking maybe they would get into a relationship, maybe there would be some sort of progression, but ultimately she decided that she wasn't ready to maintain that sense of love for herself and for somebody else. I guess something that, like I said before, is really interesting is that interpretation of Black love as well, and that the semblance of always being here for one another despite the atrocities that happened in her past, and despite all of the trauma that she's continuing to endure, despite Nadia not knowing the full story. So I was wondering, what was the process that you went through for that particular last scene, seeing as their friendship had its ups and downs, its hills and its valleys throughout the film. They had their arguments, and they did have their agreements, their disagreements. What was the process for leading up to that final scene?
I mean, I think it was really just laying the foundation of their friendship. I think from the opening scene with them, not even the opening, but from the first scene with them in the fridge, I feel like Marie is the kind of character, like, it would be really easy for her to just be a hermit, not to have a lot of friends, and just to kind of go to work, go home, have this very austere, like, routine. But I think that for me, Nadia represents the kind of woman she might have been if she hadn't gone through that trauma. And so I think having someone like that in her life, having someone who is bubbly and who's pulling her into the light, was so key and so important. And because you do see the inner struggle with her. Like, there are times when you feel like if she could just let go of this vendetta, like, she would be okay, like, you know, but I think that for me, Nadia represents that ray of hope, and, like, things can be okay. And it was important to establish that friendship really clearly and to anchor Marie's character around that in a way that made sense for the end, for Nadia to come back. And that's one of the things I'm proud of, is that a lot of people do think that the love interest will be the key. And that's something I was very conscious of not wanting to do. I didn't want it to be, you know, a man that came to save her. I felt like it was a lot more fresh and a lot more impactful to have sort of the unconditional friendship and love that she has with this other woman, for that to be the key. And yeah, I mean, I tried my best to anchor the film around that. And I think it takes you getting to the end to sort of realize that this was the central relationship all along.
Watching this, going in without much knowledge about the process behind it, I would definitely say this does not feel like a $200,000 film, and it does not feel like a first-time feature either.
Thank you.
So I would love to hear kind of what work experience you had prior that you thought really best prepared you for jumping into this really ambitious project and excelling at it, knocking it out of the park, honestly.
Thank you, because I was terrified. I think I made a lot of shorts. I mean, I feel like there's no substitute for practice. When the pandemic hit, we were initially supposed to shoot at the beginning of 2020. Then the pandemic hit, and I just thought, oh, it'll just be another 2 months, and then we'll shoot. Then 2 months turned into 6 months, and then I was like, I may never even make this film. And the opportunity from Netflix actually came that summer, and I thought, well, I'm gonna make a short film. And everyone was like, really? Why are you making another short? I was like, because there's nothing else to do, and I'm gonna get $10,000 to make something in my house, and And I hadn't shot anything in over 2 years, and I was really, really, really lucky and happy that I'd made that choice because I was so rusty. I remember the first day of shooting my short, I didn't even remember, I was so lost, I didn't remember how to talk to actors. I don't know, it was just like in such a fog, like it took me like that day to readjust, and I thought to myself, ooh, thank God I'm not on my feature, because you kind of have to be ready to go from day one. And so that short became a good dry run for me, and some of the language that we actually perfected in the feature, we tried it out in the short, because it was actually also a horror short. And so practice, working, I think the team is so important, like working with collaborators that you trust, that you've known. My DP, my editor, my composer, my producer, and I had worked together on 3 other projects, so there was a shorthand there was a trust, and I felt that they held me up at times when I was, you know, if I was having a moment or if I was not as confident, like they were there to like hold me up. And I think that it goes deeper than even being collaborators. It's like those are friends, those are real friends. These are people that I hang out with when we're not shooting anything. But I also understand the importance of collaboration and listening to other people and bringing people on your project who you feel are adding something to your vision. And so I think those were really the key for me.
I was also wondering more about, I guess, when you'd met with the actors and actresses, because the way in which they embody their characters, it was perfection. It was truly incredible. And that must mean that there was really a deep connection with the characters and also with you as well. So I was wondering how long that you had known them, interacted with them, and like the friendship that you had grown with these actors and actresses.
So Suleiman I met in 2015. We had both been, I'm also an actor, so we'd both been cast in a short together. And I wrote the film with him in mind. He was sort of he was in a film called Goodbye Solo that came out in 2011 that he got a lot of attention for, but then his career never really took off, and I was quite surprised because I thought he was such a good actor. But as we all know, for actors of color, especially for immigrants, when you have an accent, it's not as easy for you. There aren't as many opportunities in Hollywood, so I felt like, you know, I have the chance to write something, to create something for him. Being a Cameroonian-American, a Cameroonian immigrant myself, I sort of identified with his struggle, even though I grew up here and I don't have an accent, but like I wanted to create something for him. Babetida, I had not met. She lives in Brussels, so we had been introduced by a mutual friend who had worked with her, and because of the pandemic, unfortunately, I couldn't meet with her until we actually started shooting. But we spent a lot of time doing prep on Zoom. I mean, I spent so much time working on backstories, and her and Suleiman in particular, I spent a lot of time creating that history, that shared history that they have. Because I told them, like, you guys you have to have the same memories of what exactly happened between the two of you at that age. Even going through the rape was very uncomfortable, like how it happened, like detail by detail, and it was really uncomfortable for them. And I pushed them to sort of go to that uncomfortable place, because I said to them, this will pay off when we actually do the scenes. I'm not a big, I'm someone who, I mean, rehearsal's important. I think like we had a couple of days of rehearsal, but I feel like if you know where your characters are coming from, then you can be present in the scene. I don't believe in having like a ton of rehearsal. So that was the bulk of the work that we did together. Janet was a similar thing. We had been cast in a project together like a bit later in 2019. So she was sort of the last one of the trio to come on board. But all the work was done virtually, and then we all just showed up in France, and a lot of it was, I was just praying that it was gonna come together, and thankfully it did.
I think we have time to open it up maybe to 1 or 2 questions from the audience, if anybody has a question about the film.
So not about the film, but we did talk a little bit backstage about the fact that the premiere of the film in 2021 was this unfinished version, work in progress. Personally, for me, sharing works in progress is very scary.
Yeah.
So I'd love to hear what that was like for you, and if like sharing something that is unfinished and being able to receive feedback was beneficial to the final product in any way.
Yeah, I was terrified. I was shaking right up until the end. But it was a situation where, because of the pandemic, we ended up having to shoot in June because Europe had closed its borders. So it was all this mess. We shot in June, and Venice wanted a cut on July, I think it was like July 15th or something crazy like that. And we thought, all right, well, we'll just send them something. Well, they're not going to take it, but we'll send it to them. And of course, they were like, yeah, we'll screen the film. And so it was like, and I was like, there's no way I'm going to finish this in time. But we weren't in competition because we're funded through their program. So it was like, you know, they don't believe in nepotism in that over there, in that sense. So for me, the big question was, do I sit on this? Because they gave me the opportunity to wait another year. And I thought, do I sit on this film for one more year? Which felt like, didn't feel right. Or do I go to Venice? And, because who knows, like at this point, the pandemic, things were still so uncertain with the pandemic. I thought at least the festival's in person. Most festivals hadn't been in person. I'm gonna get to go, and I'm not in competition. So, you know, I think the discussion with my team was, let's just present it. Let's see how the audience responds to it. Then we can at least get some feedback from people. And we'd been sitting with it at this point for a couple of weeks. It was like, and then let's like go back and work on it and finish it afterwards. And that to me felt at least like it was gonna be very valuable, even though I felt very uncomfortable, as you said, showing it, knowing it wasn't done. But I do think ultimately it was a really smart decision, because watching it with an audience, I got so much more out of that than I think I would have if I just sat on it and watched it on my own. Even just watching it on a big screen with an audience, it really changes the way you see the film. And I made mental notes for myself of things that were working, even when people were laughing, when they weren't laughing, like those moments where I felt like I could tell what was landing. And so it was a lot easier to go back in and make changes to the cut, which we did. Not huge changes, but we cut like, I think it was 5 minutes longer, and you really felt those 5 minutes. And as soon as we shaved that off, it was mostly in the opening. The film just felt so different. And then the music and obviously the sound mix makes a big difference.
Have you started working on your next project yet, or are you still focused on?
Oh no, I'm deep in next projects, which is hard because I'm like still, you know, carrying this one on my back. But it's the first, there's nothing like the first one. I feel like I feel so grateful that it's been so well received and that it's had such a long life. And even just being here, like I didn't think anyone would still want to show this film at this point. But yeah, I'm working on the next projects. I've been, you know, developing a couple of films. I'm adapting a short story with a best-selling author. So it's like trying to juggle, you know, working on those new things, the deadlines, and also, you know, preparing for the theatrical release of this film this summer, which is a lot of work, but, you know, you get what you want, I guess.
Well, yeah, I can only imagine what kind of opportunities this kind of work must have opened up, because, yeah.
It has opened up way more than I could have ever expected, and I feel really, really blessed, and I'm excited for the new stuff that's coming. Almost all of them are thriller. My next one is a horror movie, a sci-fi horror, but everything after that they're all thrillers. So, yeah, will be fun to share.
Yeah, that'll be really exciting. Hopefully we can have another one at Ivy Film Festival someday.
Yes, I hope so too.
Is that it? Or how are we on time?
Going once.
I mean, I I have so many questions because I'm just super curious about, I know you went to film school and you also are an actor in addition to writing and directing. So, and those are all things that I'm very interested in and still have lots of questions about. Um, do you think going to film school, um, like, provided you with a certain skill set that you think not going to film school wouldn't provide you with?
I mean, it's such a personal thing. Like for me personally, I don't see how could make this film at this stage without film school. I didn't have any experience behind the camera. I'd been acting for a couple of years. I just didn't have any technical. I just didn't. I mean, I think what was helpful to me actually was all the experience I did have on set as an actor, which I didn't think was going to amount to anything, was actually super helpful. And even knowing how to work with actors, I was very comfortable working with actors, obviously. So that I didn't realize that was like 80% of my job as a director, which is very important. Well, 60%. But I do think film school provides you not only with a safety net, but like your peers. You have this network of other people who you can call on, you can lean on. Like when I got out of school and I wanted to make a short for no money, I had a couple of people to call to come help me. You know, I don't know that I would have known how to do that if I hadn't gone to film school. Some people figure it out, you know, like there are a lot of people who don't go to film school and they're able to just figure that out. But I think from my background, like I really didn't know anyone in film like that. So for me, it was really indispensable and very, very useful. And I also think that there's something about sort of concentrating your time working on the craft and uninterrupted that I think is very valuable and allows you to move a bit faster than if you don't, in my opinion.
Thank you. That's super helpful and really great to hear.
Of course.
Yeah. Do you have any more questions that you were thinking of?
I guess you're not entitled to say, but if you would like to talk a little bit more about your future projects in detail, if you're allowed to, I'd love to hear more.
I can't talk about the adaptation in detail. I can talk about, so one of them is a Western that I wrote about an immigrant woman who's working for a family in Texas. And the girl that she's watching is just turned 15. And basically is just as attached to her as when she was 5. And so her parents have decided to put the girl in boarding school so that they can like break this unnatural bond. Except that the other person who's really sad about the nanny leaving is the husband, who she's been having an affair with. And they decide to have one last night of fun before she leaves, and of course he dies. And that complicates her exit. And that's the launch pad of the film. That's all I'm gonna say about it.
I have an entire storyline set now.
It's really, it's like very pulpy, but very taut. It's like No Country for Old Men meets Zola. It's really insane. And it's very fun and very different and also funny. There's a lot of comedy in this movie. Yeah, so that's one. The others are all thrillers that I wish I could say more. This one is like my own story that I wrote, so the others are also things I wrote, but I can't talk about yet because they're in gestation, but yeah.
I've heard kind of horror stories before about people who have similarly kind of had the success in the film festival circuit, made a feature that's done well, and then kind of hit a wall. And suddenly it's a few years later and they haven't been able to find work. And it seems you've definitely managed to avoid that. But I was wondering if you had any advice for people who, you know, if you start to get some traction, how to build on that, how to keep going off of that.
I mean, that's such a good question. I feel like I learned a little bit from filmmakers before me, and I'm also like an avid writer. I love to write. It's like kind of my outlet, and I think part of what helps is having a bunch of stories that you can pitch and say, like, there's always that dreaded question of like, what's next? Like, what are you working on? And if you don't have anything to share, I think that you're sort of missing the opportunity of that this momentum is providing you. And so having a couple of ideas, you know, even if they're not fully worked out, I think is very helpful, because you can get people excited about them, and people can say, oh yeah, this is really cool, I want to work on that with you. And that's kind of what's happened to, I've almost too many ideas, but that's happened with like 2 of my projects where, you know, people have come on board because they're like, oh, okay, it's okay that you don't have them written, we want to develop it with you. And obviously the adaptation, one of the gifts of people kind of being aware of your film is I have this author that I admire whose books I read reach out to me and say, hey, I want to work with you, which is so surreal, and send me this incredible story, and then suddenly we're working together, adapting it. I mean, that you can't really plan for, but yeah, just kind of being ready for the opportunity in the moment when it comes.
Yeah, that's really good advice.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Welcome.
I think that's about it for time.
We want to thank you so much for spending your time with us and talking to us about the film and the production. We truly appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks for
Thank
having
you.
me.
Yeah.